To start this story off, I'm going to take you back to 1998. Capcom have just released one of their most polished fighting games, Street Fighter Alpha 3. The 90s most refined Street Fighter Alpha game that featured a more expansive roster of fighters than ever before. Fellow arcade giants SNK had recently released the fighting game The King of Fighters 98 for both the Neo Geo arcade and home console. King of Fighters 98 and Street Fighter Alpha 3 were both critical successes, and for many years, particularly in South America and Asia, many fans would debate over which of the two franchises was better. However, with Capcom and SNK being direct rivals within both the fighting game and arcade market, the chances of seeing the characters from these two games ever face off seemed slim. Street Fighter Alpha 3 and King of Fighters 98 would be covered by a number of gaming publications, obviously even in the same magazines due to being released around the same time. A magazine known as Arcadia would be one of these publications, and since they were covering both games, in typical clickbait fashion, they smacked King of Fighters vs Street Fighter across their bloody front cover. This would lead many people who purchased the magazine to automatically assume there was a crossover in the works, and it would only be a matter of time until we saw the cast of Street Fighter duke it out with the King of Fighters. The magazine's arguably misleading clickbait led to a general uproar within the magazine's metaphorical comment section, with many readers voicing their annoyance at the publication's content creators. Some say that this racket and noise grabbed the attention of both Capcom and SNK, which would supposedly result in the two companies initially signing an agreement that they could make one fighting game each, using each other's intellectual properties. In addition to this, SNK would also make some SNK vs Capcom card games, but we will get into talking about these another time. With regards to Capcom and SNK making one fighting game each using both sets of IPs, the company struck a deal that would entail that the distributing company would gain all the profits from the game they had published, and not the company that licensed the characters for use. Basically meaning that Capcom would take all the money from the game they made, and SNK would receive the whole pot from the game they had made. The first of these two games would be published by SNK, and see a release in 1999. The game would be titled SNK vs Capcom The Match of the Millennium, and would arrive exclusively on the Neo Geo Pocket Color handheld. Now I could talk about this game now, but I'm actually going to save speaking about this one for another time, as every Thursday we are currently focusing on versus games developed by Capcom, so let's move straight on to talking about Capcom's offering. Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000 would first arrive in the arcades in Japan on August the 13th in the year 2000. Like Marvel vs Capcom 2, that was released the same year, the game would run on the powerful Sega Naomi hardware, the arcade board that shared many of the same components with that of the Sega Dreamcast. Once again, like with Marvel vs Capcom 2, the hardware similarities between the Naomi and Sega home console would make porting the game over to the Dreamcast extremely easy, which would result in the game arriving in homes just 1 month later. Anyway, without further ado, let us check out the introductory scene of Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000. Yeah!
Capcom.
Capcom versus SNK. Millennium Fight 2000.
Capcom versus SNK. Millennium Fight 2000.
As you can see from the game's introduction, the rumour that nobody believed was true was now a reality. The opening scene tries to hype the player by showing screenshots from a number of old Street Fighter and King of Fighters games. the text suggests that it is finally time to establish who is the strongest. So let's take a look at this unbelievable game. Rather than arriving instantly at a player select screen when starting the game, you're instead asked to select a groove, with the two choices either being Capcom or SNK. The two grooves are essentially two different gameplay systems, both of which we shall talk about shortly. From there, you then reach the character select screen, where you pick fighters, followed by a choice between playing at either normal or turbo play speed. Now let's talk about the game's roster. The game features 33 different playable characters, with 28 of those being available from the beginning and the other as unlockables. As expected, the game presents as an even split of both characters from the Capcom universe with those from the SNK universe. Interestingly, and perhaps even disappointingly, aesthetically, the roster is not as diverse as Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and as a result there are far less cutesy and zany characters present. No Mega Mans, Rolls or Amingos here. In fact, when it comes to Capcom's offerings, nearly every fighter is just from the Street Fighter franchise. The only exception to this is Morrigan, who features as the lone non-Street Fighter Capcom character. I guess they just must have wanted this game to have a slightly more serious tone. On SNK's side of things, the roster would mix characters from the King of Fighters, Fatal Fury, The Art of Fighting, and even Samurai Showdown, leading to a little more diversity in terms of franchises on the SNK side of things. However, most of the characters all look like they mean serious business. I guess compared to Marvel vs. Capcom, this game was no laughing matter. I guess Capcom having their characters face off with comic book superheroes and villains was just a rough and tumble, but against fighting game characters from another company, this was war. As you would expect from a game containing roster members from various 2D fighting games, Capcom vs SNK is a 2D fighting game. With regards to the game's fighting mechanics, let us start off by talking about the two grooves. The Capcom groove is a gameplay system that has been taken straight from the Street Fighter Alpha series, which basically consists of filling the 3-level combo gauge in order to perform more powerful special moves. The SNK groove, on the other hand, consists of manually charging up the meter by holding down both heavy attack buttons in order to perform super moves. In addition to this, the SNK groove also features something known as Desperation Mode, which gives a fighter an advantage when their life is nearly depleted. In terms of gameplay mechanics, this title introduces more than just a groove system though. The game also entails something known as the ratio system, which results in every character in the game being split into 4 different groups. The 4 groups are all based on strength, with ratio 1 characters being the weakest, with ratio 4 characters being the top of the food chain. This means that when commencing a match or an entire playthrough, you must select a team, but the combined team's ratio must equal no higher than 4. For example, you could pick a team of multiple ratio 1 characters, or you could just pick one character from ratio 4. The choice is yours. In terms of how the characters were split into these 4 groups, ratio 2 just appears to be more popular characters than that of those from ratio 1. Ratio 3 appears to be characters who were bosses in previous games, and ratio 4 seems to be more powerful hidden fighters such as Akuma, Evil Ryu and Orochi Iori, if I am pronouncing that right, which I doubt I am. To state the obvious, fights are won in this game when all the fighters on the opposing team have been knocked out. As expected, the sizes of the teams vary depending from which ratio group fighters have been chosen from. The ratio system in this game sadly leads to a few drawbacks. For example, the combinations of fighters in regards to different teams you can form is limited and restrictive, as the ratio can never add up to more than 4. So the huge variation in teams, like in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, is absent here. The other drawback is a character is only as powerful as that of the person who happens to be controlling them. So calling the ratio 4 characters the most powerful is kind of subjective really. In most cases, you probably have a better chance of winning most fights with 4 ratio 1 characters rather than just 1 ratio 4. As although the ratio 1 characters deal less damage with regular attacks, their specials and their combo abilities can be very effective. So strength in numbers often seems to be the winning formula here. Although these issues can be somewhat rectified later in the game when you unlock the ability to edit character ratios in versus mode, opening up a lot more choice and ability to create more tailored teams. In terms of the game's visuals, personally I think they look pretty fantastic. The matches take place in glorious 2D, with most of the Capcom sprites appearing to have been plucked from the Street Fighter Alpha series, and the SNK ones all being drawn from scratch. A strong case could be made that the SNK lineup of characters redrawn in the Street Fighter art style arguably looks even better than ever before. The stage backdrops look absolutely great. They are more detailed than any found in the earlier Marvel vs games, and have certainly aged a lot better than the 3D backgrounds found within Marvel vs Capcom 2. The stages in this game are bright, vivid and offer a lot of movement. In terms of play modes, the Dreamcast version of the game offers an arcade, versus, practice and team attack mode, as well as a secret mode where you can spend your points accumulated throughout the game on alternate costumes and stages, automatically giving the game additional single player replay value over many older fighting games. So, as you can see, Capcom vs SNK is a very different beast to the Marvel vs Capcom series, and features many gameplay elements that widely differ from the games within that series. With this said, I guess it is time to go back and look at how this game was received by journalists of the time period. They absolutely loved Marvel vs Capcom 2 earlier that year, but what did they think of the first Capcom vs SNK game on a home console? Let us find out. GameSpot would review the game favourably, summarising that, issues of balance aside, Capcom have produced a great game. Though the SNK characters' repertoires of moves had to be simplified in order to fit into the Capcom scheme, what remains of them works quite well in the present context. Fans of either series would do well to check the game out, as it needn't be reiterated how tempting fights between the characters of these rival companies are to watch unfold, let alone have an active hand in. The video game critic would add to this with, the graphics here are stellar, and the backgrounds are the best I've seen in any fighter, hands down. Many of the stages have interesting intro sequences as well, and the excellent music is also worth noting. Gaming Target would pile the praise on by stating, if there is only one fighting game to get for the rest of the year, surely this is it. It may have its share of slight problems, but the stupendous gameplay is just too good to pass up. IGN loved this game too, and would round their write-up up with, Capcom vs SNK shouldn't be measured by what it isn't, but instead by what it is. A slightly flawed, if not terrific, fusion of some of the best fighting games to ever grace our consoles. Capcom vs SNK stands tall as one of the single greatest Dreamcast games ever released. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The game was popular with critics despite the game's minor flaws. When it comes to Capcom though, you know just one single iteration of a game is never enough. So as a result, Capcom vs SNK will be back in the following year with a new iteration of the game. This update would be known as Capcom vs SNK Pro. So let us have a look at what this version was all about. The game introduced two new characters, Joe Higashi from Fatal Fury along with Dan Hibiki from the Street Fighter Alpha series. On top of this, existing characters would be given new moves and new play modes were introduced. But was it really worth releasing this update to the game just 1 year after the last version? Pro was released on two different home consoles eventually, the first of which was the Sega Dreamcast. The Dreamcast version of the game was released exclusively in Japan, which one would probably put down to the slow death of the Dreamcast in North America. The game remains largely the same as its predecessor, with very few tweaks here and there. GameSpot would cover this Japanese exclusive, praising the game for many of the same reasons they did the previous year. However, they would also state that if you already have the first game and have played it long enough to unlock many of its secrets, you'll find that picking up an import copy of Millennium Fight Pro amounts to nothing more than paying full price for two characters, and that just isn't worth it. Away from the Dreamcast, the existence of Capcom vs SNK Pro would lead to the game being released on the Sony PlayStation. But let us keep in mind that Capcom vs SNK was designed to run on the Sega Naomi. So how well could the much weaker Sony PlayStation do when it came to handling the game? especially when you consider that the system had never been good when it comes to running 2D sprite based titles. For a PlayStation title, Capcom vs SNK Pro is decent, but it pales in comparison to its Dreamcast counterpart. The colour palette looks more washed out and the sprites look less vibrant too. Cuts were also made to both the character and background animations, making movement less fluid as a result. But apart from those differences, the game is not as hindered as the Marvel vs Capcom series on the platform. IGN would cover the PlayStation version of this game, stating, "There hasn't been a PS1 fighter this good since Alpha 3. Dreamcast vets, however, may want to stay away, as there's nothing here to entice those folk to go the downgrade route. Even still, Capcom vs SNK is a great slugger and deserves our wholehearted recommendation for the new and uninitiated alike." GameSpot on the other hand would be a little less positive with their version, stating Capcom vs SNK Pro for the PlayStation is about as good a port as it could be, all things considered. However, there are a lot of things to consider. The game is on the aged PlayStation hardware, it has some pretty substantial load times, it doesn't play very well with the standard DualShock controller, and thanks to its lower graphical resolution, it tends to have less detailed backgrounds and ugly special effects. It's also a port of a game that came out 2 years ago. So, that about rounds off all the different versions of Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000. The first version of the game on the Naomi and Dreamcast was a beautiful little title that offered a play experience that was largely different from Marvel vs Capcom 2 that launched the same year. Although the ratio system was flawed in places, it was interesting to see Capcom try something new with their tried and tested fighting game genre. Capcom vs SNK Pro on the other hand stinks of a typical Capcom style cash grab, where they release the same game with minimal changes multiple times in a greedy effort to make a little bit of extra cash. I guess they had those SNK IPs and they wanted to milk them for all they were worth. Match of the Millennium is a fighting game that was released for the handheld in the winter of 1999, predating the Dreamcast crossover game by nearly a year. For a 90s handheld title, the game features an impressive roster of characters, 26 in total actually, 8 of which though are hidden and need to be unlocked. In addition to the sizable roster, the game offers a large selection of play modes and customizable options, all in all making this title pretty deep for simply a handheld offering, with a fair bit for me to cover. The game is obviously a versus fighter, and looks and plays practically the same as King of Fighters R2, another great little fighting game released by SNK on the Neo Geo Pocket Color, earlier that very same year. The game's roster mixes a selection of SNK and Capcom characters, just as the name would suggest. In terms of individual franchises covered, they pretty much match similar ones to those featured within Capcom vs SNK, which was released later on the Dreamcast, but SNK seems to have done a little better job with variation on the Capcom side of things with this one. In the Dreamcast game, Morrigan is the only playable character who is not from the Street Fighter games. In Match of the Millennium, on the other hand, she is joined by fellow Darkstalkers combatants BB Hood and Felicia, although the rest are still all Street Fighters. Upon powering the game on, the game's main menu instantly offers a variety of play options. We shall start off by talking about the game's Tourney Mode, which, as you would expect, lets you fight through a tourney. Upon selecting this mode, it then gives you 3 options. You can choose between a single, tag and team mode, which is pretty self-explanatory really with regards to what each of these functions present. Basically modes that consist of 1-on-1 matches, 2-on-2 matches and 3 fighter queue teams. But then the game gives you a further choice between average, counter and rush. These are playstyles that differ depending on your choice. The best way to describe playstyles is that they are basically the same as grooves, which we covered earlier in the week with the Dreamcast game. The average style is similar to the style found in most Street Fighter games. Basically you are given a multi-level gauge, which you must fill in order to perform super combos. The counter style is the SNK style, where you manually fill a gauge through button tapping. In addition to this, characters enter desperation mode when their life bar is nearly empty, which gives them an advantage when they are up against the wall. Rush Mode, interestingly, is inspired by the Darkstalkers franchise, which involves saving up a 3-level stock of power. This power can be used to perform a super combo, but unlike average and counter modes, will not completely drain the super combo gauge. In terms of the tourney modes, you obviously must fight your way through various encounters, much like one would expect. About halfway through a playthrough, you must face off against your character's designated rival in a quick 1-round encounter. Winning and losing this match will help determine how a playthrough ends. The final stage of a playthrough, if you lose, sees you face off against the tag team of Geese and Bison, 2 respective last bosses from the King of Fighters and Street Fighter series. However, if you are successful in defeating your rival earlier in the game, there is an additional bout against Orochi Iori or Evil Ryu. If you clear this final stage, you will get the game's good ending, otherwise the bad ending is presented. This is also helpful in unlocking the game's secret characters. The 8 characters are unlockable by beating the tourney mode. Once achieved, a silhouette appears of the secret characters covered by 3x3 grids of blocks. The amount of blocks removed will depend on if you defeated your rival along with either Evil Ryu or Orochi Iori. Once all blocks have been removed from the character, they have then been unlocked. This quest for unlockables is one of the many elements of this game that gives it such a large amount of replayability. In terms of the character unlocking process, it is also of note that this task can be sped up via transferring data from the SNK vs Capcom Card Fighter Clash that can also be experienced on the Neo Geo Pocket Color. Moving away from Tourney Mode, the other significant play mode is known as Olympic Mode, which involves breaking what the game refers to as event records. Olympic Mode offers a whole range of things to do, from survival, where you must defeat 100 straight opponents, to time attack, where you must beat 5 opponents in the quickest time possible, to first blast, where you must fight 10 one-blow matches to achieve a high score. In addition to this, Olympic Mode features minigames that are nothing to do with the fighting game genre, such as Catwalk for example, which is a very basic rhythm game, similar to Guitar Hero. We also have Ghost Trick, where you must jump backwards and forwards across ledges as Arthur from Ghosts and Goblins, whose inclusion is surprising considering they made a sprite for him for this minigame, yet is not a playable fighter. There is even a shooter minigame where you play as Marco from Metal Slug and reenact one of the Metal Slug game's final boss fights. And finally, there is Target 9 where you play as Juby from the Samurai Showdown series in a reaction-based game slashing things with your sword. When I say that this little game is packed to the brim with surprising content, I am really not exaggerating. SNK vs Capcom, the Millennium match, is very possibly the greatest fighting game made for a handheld in the 90s. Although cute and simplistic in some ways, the scale-back nature of this on the simple Neo Geo Pocket Color hardware delivers a game that is very fluid looking and responsive to play. The music in the game complements the entire experience, offering simple renditions of various famous Capcom and SNK tunes. I would guess this is one of those games that remains under-celebrated today, due to the fact that it was published exclusively for a system that basically no one owned. The game is shockingly good, and extremely satisfying to play. This may be a very controversial thing to say, but I think I prefer this one over Capcom vs SNK for the Dreamcast. But that could be partially down to the fact that I simply love games on basic handhelds. The limitations presented with these things often lead to some very unique games. All in all, I feel that the game was extremely worthy of highlighting today, and acts as yet another chapter within the Capcom vs Games history. It is the summer of 2001. We are now at a point in history where the Capcom vs series is now 5 years old. The games released within this line have made the series Capcom's most popular fighting game range of the time period. This all started out in 1996 with the tantalising release of X-Men vs Street Fighter, which was spurred on and inspired by the inclusion of Akuma placed as an unlockable character within X-Men Children of the Atom. This game would be followed up by Marvel's Superheroes vs Street Fighter, which expanded the choice of characters to include Marvel characters other than just X-Men, which brought us to the third game, Marvel vs Capcom, which would obviously expand Capcom's lineup to include more than just a cast of Street Fighter. Moving forward to the fourth game, we had Marvel vs Capcom 2, which would utilise Sega Naomi hardware, introducing 3D backdrops and expanding the roster to include a whopping 56 characters. This game was absolutely huge in scope. Past this point, we reached Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000, a game that was developed and published by Capcom to include characters owned by Capcom and fellow fighting game giants SNK. In order to produce this game, a deal was made between the two companies, allowing both entities to publish one fighting game each, using each other's IPs. One of the clauses in this deal would include that each separate company would receive 100% of the profits off the back of the game they individually published. As part of this deal, SNK will publish a game known as SNK vs Capcom Match of the Millennium, which was a fighting game for the 16-bit Neo Geo Pocket Color handheld, which we have also covered in depth on this channel previously. Capcom's game, Millennium Fight 2000, sold very well, and as a result was profitable for the Big C. However, Match of the Millennium by SNK sold pretty badly, and even combined with its non-fighting game counterpart, SNK vs Capcom Card Fighters, the two SNK published games combined sold less than 50,000 units, and these were two of the company's most important releases around the time, and flagship games for SNK's underperforming handheld system. SNK had recently made a lot of bad business decisions. Their handhelds had flopped, they failed to turn over decent profit from their deal with Capcom, and other endeavours too had not gone to plan, such as the Neo Geo CD home console and the Hyper Neo Geo 64 arcade system, which had also not produced good results. Despite all of this though, Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000 had been successful enough of an endeavour for Capcom to successfully negotiate a new deal with the flailing company, which would result in the development of the beloved game's sequel, which I shall show the introduction to now.
Capcom.
This is the tournament for the new millennium. You'll experience the most exciting battle in history. Let's get ready to battle. Feel the intensity when power and technique collide. Crush the competition. A battle beyond your imagination. Let the martial arts madness begin. 2001 is the year we make contact. Welcome to the revolution.
Capcom vs SNK 2. Millionaire Fighting 2001.
As you can see, the intro doesn't do much really to establish much about the game. No gameplay footage is featured, only a few of the roster members are shown, and it seems more focused on the year the game was released, rather than anything else. Corporate entities did seem pretty obsessed with the Millennium in general though, to be fair. It was almost like they got some kind of bug. Capcom vs SNK 2 Mark of the Millennium 2001, known as Millionaire Fighting 2001 in Japan, instantly opens up by letting the player choose a groove. Going back to the prior installment in the series, a groove is a gameplay style, and back in Millennium Fight you could choose between two. One groove offered mechanics more in line with the Street Fighter title, whereas the other groove was more in line with mechanics present within the King of Fighters series. This game, however, appears to offer 6 different grooves as opposed to just 2. We shall get into what these entail shortly. However, upon picking one, we are moved to the character select screen, offering a huge roster of fighters with a grand total of 48, which is a lot more choice than with the game that came before it. Just like in the first Capcom vs SNK game's case, the game is yet another traditional 2D fighting game, and once again utilises the power of Sega Naomi arcade hardware. Just like in the original, the meat and potatoes of this game consist of the player selecting a team of fighters from various Capcom and SNK games, then must fight each other's teams, winning battles by defeating all of the opponents from the opposing team. Elements that were included in the previous game make a return, but many are tweaked, which would include the ratio system. The first game allowed you to build a team based around certain characters' in-game power levels, which could total up to no more than 4. For example, you could build a team of 4 level 1 characters, have a team of 2 level 2 characters, or fight with 1 level 4 character. As long as the number added up to 4, you were all good. In regards to the ratios in the game's sequel, teams this time around can consist of no more than a maximum of 3 fighters, which I guess makes a lot of sense, as the previous game gave a player an advantage who selected 4 level 1 characters over other combination teams. In terms of how this fighter controls, changes were made that made the game different from the predecessor too. The first title controls were based on the King of Fighters series, a 2-strength 4-button system of punches and kicks. This game on the other hand uses a 3-strength 6-button system instead, which is arguably more appealing to fighting game diehards. In terms of other mechanics, a lot of it is derivative of Street Fighter Alpha. However, the biggest changes from that game would relate to the grooves, which we touched on earlier in the video. The grooves are engineered to mimic other Capcom and SNK fighters. 2 of these grooves are like the ones that were featured in the previous game. The 4 new systems dictate the character's super gauge system, special techniques, the character's dashing, running and guard cancels. These are each designated via different letters, CAP to SNK. To run through these really quick, the C groove was inspired by Street Fighter Alpha, A groove was based off of Street Fighter Alpha 3, P groove draws inspiration from Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, S groove from King of Fighters 94, N groove from King of Fighters 96, and K groove from the Samurai Showdown series. There are a lot of customizable options to experiment with and get your head around here. Obviously, the next major change introduced into this entry in the series is the game's roster of characters themselves. As mentioned, this game contains 48 different fighters, which is a marked improvement over the number included in the previous game. The game includes fighters from a broader range of different fighting games than that of before. On the Capcom side of things, this roster would include, for example, Kosuke Kagami from the Rival Schools franchise and Rolento from Final Fight. However, to be fair, Rolento did also appear within the Alpha series. We also have the debut of Meiki Generaisai, a waifu from Final Fight 2, and Eagle from the first ever Street Fighter game for some reason. Yun from Street Fighter 3 would also be the sole representative from the Street Fighter 3 games, which tells you all you need to know with what Capcom thought of that installment in the series really. In terms of SNK Newcomers, there will be a few characters on their side of things too. These would include Rock Howard from Gairu Mark of the Wolves, Hayo Maru from Samurai Shodown, Ryu Haku Todo from Art of Fighting, Athena Asamiya from Psycho Soldier, Hibiki Takane from The Last Blade 2, and Chang and Choi from King of Fighters 94. All in all, that was a lot of different, very Japanese names for me to butcher. But from all of this, it seems pretty clear that the roster is a little bit more diverse in terms of franchises included than with the previous game. But I suppose it is still very Street Fighter and King of Fighters heavy. Speaking of the many fighters this game includes from numerous games and hardware eras, you would hope that Capcom would have gone to the effort to redraw the sprites to make sure they all fit into this game's new environment. However, inspecting this game, it appears to be far from the case, and often draws some criticism due to this reason. It is almost an ongoing joke that Capcom have not updated Morrigan's sprite, for example, from the original Darkstalkers game from all the way back in 1994. Bearing in mind that this was a game that was released 7 years later, she looks completely different from newer sprites within this game. In contrast to SNK characters, many of the Capcom sprites look substandard and lazily copied and pasted straight into this game from many years prior. SNK characters look really nice, whereas there is no uniformness when it comes to the Capcom bunch. Most are just brought over from Street Fighter Alpha 3, and as mentioned, Morrigan is straight from Darkstalkers, making her the lowest resolution fighter of them all. To make this game look even more weird, some Capcom fighters did get redrawn specifically for this series, such as Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li and M. Bison. I guess those characters are more popular than most in the game. It still seems an odd move though to only bother doing part of the job. In terms of the stage backdrops, you would have probably noticed that the 2D backgrounds from the first game are now gone and 3D backdrops have been drawn in their places. This graphical style is identical to that of which was used in Marvel vs Capcom 2, which we covered on this channel at an earlier date. Whilst these backgrounds are bright, vibrant and imaginative, they still have not aged as well as the backgrounds that were found in the first Capcom vs SNK game. The backgrounds do not look bad by any stretch, but they just look a little bit dated today, whereas games with 2D backdrops from this time period retain their timeless appeal. Music wise, I don't think it's anything to either complain about or praise really. The best way of describing it is that it all sounds very Dreamcasty. Now I know there are some great tracks here and there on the platform, but out of all of the Sega systems, I find music that appeared on the Dreamcast to be the least inspiring. Once again, there is nothing wrong with the music, it just all sounds very much like free stock music, if that makes any sense to you. Let me know your thoughts on this matter though, as I may not be the best judge in this category. As you would expect from a game programmed to run on Sega Naomi arcade hardware, the first platform the game would arrive on would be the Sega Dreamcast after the arcade. GameSpot would cover the launch of this game in October of 2001, which would only ever see a release in Japan on this platform due to Sega of America cutting off support for the system in the West by that point. With regards to GameSpot's take of the first console porting of this game, they gave their thoughts stating they believed the changes in the game will have a more significant impact depending on how serious you are about your 2D fighters. The new additions make the game technically superior to the first, but not necessarily better enough to merit purchase if you already have the first one. GameSpot would go on to criticise the game's 6-button controls, stating they were not suitable for a Dreamcast pad, whilst praising the game's groove system, allowing the player a lot of customisable options. Another aspect they would praise would be a feature that would debut in the console version of this game, which is the unlockable ability to create your own groove, offering even more customization than ever before. GameSpot would criticise the reuse of many very old sprites within the game, stating Capcom vs SNK 2 looks about the same as last year's game. It's been said before, but some of those characters look simply archaic by now. One-Eyed Sagat hasn't changed since Street Fighter Alpha from 1995, and Morrigan the Succubus from the Darkstalkers series dates back even earlier. The game's biggest graphical problem is still that the art style throughout is so inconsistent from character to character. GameSpot would rave about the stage backdrops, with praise such as the characters all seem to blend in well with the game's attractive new fully 3D backgrounds, which are filled with some really obscure references to some of Capcom's and SNK's older games. Interestingly, the GameSpot review from 2001 completely agreed with my opinion on the game's music, stating, "All new music mostly consists of the same sort of forgettable and sometimes grating dance beats found in the original. So I guess the music never sounded fresh or interesting in 2001 either." The write-up would conclude with fans of the first Capcom vs SNK game should be pleased with the sequel if they don't expect too much from it. Capcom vs SNK 2 offers just enough additions and changes to be justifiable as the next complete game in the series, though it doesn't take any major detours. It's cut from the same cloth as countless other Capcom fighting games, but it's got more features, more characters and more depth than a lot of them. Other review sources appeared to like this Dreamcast game too, with TotalGames.net for example calling it the most beautifully balanced, well-crafted 2D beat-em-up to grace God's fair earth. With the Dreamcast dead and mostly buried in the West, the game would launch worldwide in the living room when it was ported over to the Sony PlayStation 2, a platform which to this very day is still the most popular games console of all time. GameSpot would revisit this game on a different platform literally 1 month later, confirming that the PlayStation 2 version of this 2D fighting game is essentially identical to the Dreamcast version that was recently released in Japan. As a result, that PS2 review for this game by GameSpot is pretty similar to their Dreamcast article, although they did upgrade the review score from a 7.8 up to an 8.1 for what appears to be on account for the fact that the PS2 at the time had less decent 2D fighters than that of the Dreamcast. IGN would praise it too, stating it is a very fine 2D fighter. The only disadvantage to its arrival on the PS2 is its inevitable difficulty caused by the PS2's controller. Past this point, the game would arrive on both the original Xbox and the Nintendo GameCube, meaning that the game had appeared across all 4 major consoles that generation. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this was the first Capcom fighting game to appear on a Nintendo console since Street Fighter Alpha 2 on the Super Nintendo, so it had been a while for the big N. The ports on these systems were tweaked from the PS2 and the Dreamcast versions, and as a result the game was released as Capcom vs SNK 2 EO, with the EO standing for Easy Operation. Easy Operation referred to a change in control mechanics that allowed the player to perform special attacks by simply moving the right analog stick in a certain direction. All the home console versions of the game include some bonus characters such as Evil Ryu, Orochi Irori, Shin Akuma, and Ultimate Rugal. All 4 of these characters are powered up versions of existing fighters within the arcade game. The GameCube version of the game contains a new groove known as the GC groove, which has simplified controls for the GameCube's inferior controller that is not particularly suitable for fighting games. Obviously, this is if you do not include Smash as a fighting game, but I'm opening a can of worms for even mentioning the prospect. The groove is also present in the Xbox version as the EO groove, which we already mentioned stands for Easy Operation. Speaking of the Xbox version of the game, it would include online play for up to 2 players via the use of the Xbox Live service. As expected from a 2D game, which as you would gather would be fairly simple to run on the 4 consoles the game was ported to, the game is virtually identical across all 4 systems with only minor differences. Despite this, the GameCube version of the game would receive lower scores than for other platforms due to the console's poor native controller, which was not designed paying any thought to how traditional fighting games would handle on the platform. I have no idea why people love the GameCube controller so much. It's awful. So I guess that pretty much sums up the history of the game and how it functioned. In recent months, this game has been one of the most heavily requested games for me to cover on here for quite some time. Looking at my comments alone, it appears that many gamers out there view this as their favourite fighting game of all time. From my experience with the game, along with the research I've performed on this title, this appears to be one of those fighting games that seems to really click with more hardcore fighting game appreciators out there, but a game that gets somewhat overlooked by the greater public. For this reason, it has quite a lot in common with the Street Fighter 3 series in regards to the fact that mechanically it is a great fighting game. However, it does not appear to have the same amount of demand to be played as some other games from the company. Marvel vs Capcom 2, for example, seems to have a much bigger and more vocal fan base, which makes a lot of sense considering how big Marvel and its branding is today, let alone how popular the game was at the time. SNK on the other hand is a brand that is only extremely popular in certain regions and remains either on the peripheral or appreciated amongst the connoisseurs of the genre elsewhere. So is Capcom vs SNK 2 one of the greatest fighting games ever? Once again, it all depends on your taste. Some may like the simple classics like Street Fighter 2, some may prefer the chaotic nature of the Marvel vs Capcom series. There are so many factors to account into all of this. I think at the very least it would be tough to argue a case for this game not at least being the greatest Capcom vs SNK crossover game of them all. And we still have one more fighting game to cover, which featured the two companies fighting it out. As just mentioned, we have already analysed many of the titles from this fighting crossover series. This includes the first two fighting games that were published as a result of Capcom and SNK striking a business deal. Capcom would release Capcom vs SNK for the arcade, Dreamcast and other platforms, whereas SNK would release their title SNK vs Capcom Match of the Millennium as an exclusive for one of their own systems, the Neo Geo Pocket Color. Capcom's game would prove successful enough for the company to strike a new deal, allowing them to publish Capcom vs SNK 2, the second crossover game using these IPs by Capcom, and the third crossover game between the two brands overall. The fourth game, though, SNK vs Capcom SVC Chaos, was neither published by Capcom or SNK, and instead published by a company known as Playmore. So, let us take a quick look at what happened here to get everyone up to scratch. The late 90s and early 2000s were a tough time for SNK. The company would continue to make mistake after mistake that would continue to shape their future. As mentioned in previous weeks, in the space of just a few years, SNK had released the Neo Geo CD, the Hyper Neo Geo 64 and the Neo Geo Pocket Handheld. All platforms that never really caught on with consumers to the same level as the Neo Geo AES. Through all of this nonsense, in January 2000, SNK's poor financial status would lead to the company being acquired by a corporation known as Aruze. Aruze are a company known for manufacturing pachinko machines. This acquisition was mostly driven so that Aruze could feature King of Fighters characters on their pachinko devices. Video games at this point were simply a secondary purpose of the corporate procurement. All this would take place the same year that the original deal would be struck between Capcom and SNK to make the crossover games. So with this in mind, it starts to make a lot more sense why SNK did not take full advantage of Capcom's properties, as it appears they were simply much more preoccupied with pachinko. In fact, SNK under Aruze's control would continue to downsize the gaming side of the company's business and would cease all American operations by June of that year. Rights to the distribution of their arcades in the region were sold, and localization of releases for their console games were sold to outside companies. Through all of this, a mass exodus of SNK employees would take place, with many of their best and brightest jumping to Capcom and others found in their own development houses, such as Dimps for example, who would ironically be the company who SNK would allow to develop Match of the Millennium. SNK would continue to hemorrhage employees, including another group, leaving to make a development house known as Breezersoft, who would win the rights to develop games such as King of Fighters 2001. Through this period of turmoil, even Akichi Kawasaki would leave the company, the very man who founded SNK in the first place. Like other leavers, he too would form a company, in his case in August of 2001, with a little company known as Playmore, the company we mentioned that developed and published SVC Chaos at the beginning of this video, the game I promise we will get to very soon. By October 2001, SNK would be in such a bad financial situation that they would have to file for bankruptcy. This would result in them having to put all of their intellectual property rights for its franchises up for auction. This arc in SNK history though would fortunately have a happy ending, as the winning bid for SNK's intellectual property rights would be won by Playmore, the company owned by Kawasaki, the man who was the very brand's original owner. Yeah. From here, Playmore would even go as far as to hire back many of the SNK employees and would even acquire Breezesoft and other development houses in this period of mass reconstruction. Distribution deals and new international offices were re-established around the world, including a return to the good old USA, operating under the new name SNK Neo Geo. By 2002, Kawasaki would manage yet another huge win when he successfully sued Aruze for 6.2 billion Japanese yen, due to the fact they were continuing to use SNK intellectual properties on their bloody pachinko machines after the acquisition. SNK founder Kawasaki really did get the ultimate revenge on the company that drove the brand into the ground. In my opinion, this story is a hugely inspirational one, and SNK's rise from its deathbed is as interesting a story as any. However, now we have got to this stage of the journey, we finally arrive at the release of SNK vs Capcom SVC Chaos. So let's jump straight to this game's introduction.
SVC Chaos, SNK vs Capcom.
As you can see, the game's introduction does not show off any gameplay. However, it shows off a few of the game's characters, including Kyo, Akuma, and Palette Swap Ken. It even shows off a mysterious new character, who we shall get to shortly. From the player select screen, the original arcade version of this game opens up with offering the player a choice of 24 different fighters. However, when you include bosses and secret characters, the roster opens up to a total of 36. Since this game was not developed by Capcom like Capcom vs SNK 2, the game is both artistically and graphically very different to Capcom's offering from 2 years earlier. Changes do not end here though, as the gameplay is very different too. The title is heavily based on those found within the King of Fighters series, with King of Fighters 2002 being the most similar. This means that the game has a 4-button configuration and many of the same techniques being carried over. The 4-button system incorporates light and strong kicks, punches, cancels and charging attacks. The game differs though from the regular King of Fighters formula, as the team battle format is not carried over, instead offering players simple round-based one-on-one encounters. Teddy Long was not pleased with this one. All matches start out with some dialogue and often trash talk between the fighters, which I guess at least gives the characters a little more motivation to fight. In terms of completely new mechanics that this game would introduce, a technique would debut known as the front grand step, a maneuver that would allow players to cancel attacks with a forward dash. This can be executed while guarding from an opponent's move, but will consume 1 power gauge level. Speaking of the game's power gauges, the ones featured in this game are known as the Groove Power Gauge system. These gauges consist of 3 levels that feel as a player both lands and blocks attacks. Unlike its predecessor, Capcom vs SNK 2, SVC Chaos on the other hand features no air guards and has no traditional groove system, instead focusing on quicker gameplay. Going back to the gauges, when the gauge is filled to either the first or the second level, players have the ability to perform special moves, guard against cancel attacks, and even guard against guard cancel front step maneuvers. When the gauge is filled up all 3 levels and it's at max power, your characters reach a state known as max activation. During this phase, a timer is activated, and the character has the ability to cancel any of their moves at any time, as well as still being able to perform super special moves and guard cancels. When the time expires, the gauge simply returns to level 2. Further from the super special moves, characters also have something known as exceed moves, additional attacks that can be executed when the player's life bar is less than half. Basically a desperation move, if you will. Like previous crossover games between these two brands, this title's fighting roster is extremely King of Fighters and Street Fighter 2 heavy, which begs the question as to why they never simply called these titles Street Fighter 2 vs King of Fighters in the first place, as this is certainly the main sources where most characters have been taken from. To be fair though to SVC Chaos, this game has more characters from elsewhere than others from the 2 corporate entities. So let us touch on some of these character additions, starting with those who are available in the game's initial 24 character selection. On SNK side of things, they present several characters from the Samurai Showdown series, including Earthquake from the first game, Genjuro from the second, and most quirkily of all, Shiki from the failed Samurai Showdown 64 game for the Hyper Neo Geo arcade hardware. Capcom would present 2 non-Street Fighter characters in their initial lineup, which would consist of Hugo from Final Fight, who does appear in Street Fighter 3 to be fair, but it does also have Tessa, a sorcerologist from a more obscure Capcom fighting game known as Red Earth, a title a few people have been asking me to cover on here, so maybe I'll consider that one soon. The 12 characters not up for initial selection from the game are all varieties of different boss characters that can be accessed to fight against in different ways, which we will begin discussing with the 4 regular end boss characters one may encounter depending on who they play as. On the Capcom side of things, we first have Shin Akuma, the powered up version of regular Akuma. We also have Violent Ken, who would very recently be included in Ultra Street Fighter 2 on the Nintendo Switch. This was the first time the character ever appeared in a game, after taking inspiration from a form of Ken which was included in the Street Fighter 2 manga. I wish they would hurry up and give Bluster Kong the same respect, so that they could place him in Smash. He is such a benevolent ape. SNK's bosses consist of Orochi Iori, who has also appeared in all the other Capcom SNK crossover games, and secondly, a ridiculous character known as Sirius Mr. Karate, who was first shown off in the game's introductory sequence. Basically, the King of Fighters and Art of Fighting series has a character known as Takuma, who sometimes dons a Tengu mask and insists he's Mr. Karate. He delivers speeches that are supposed to rally morale, but often just make him look silly. Serious Mr. Karate seems to be based upon Takuma's personality, but this form appears to be non-canon with the other games, like which is often the case with these crazy crossover scenarios. Moving on from the standard boss encounters, the game also features mid-boss encounters too. In order to face off with these mid-bosses, various requirements must be met, such as using an exceed attack for example. Out of the mid-bosses from other SNK vs titles, both Geese Howard and Dan Hibiki return to this game. Goei Nitz from King of Fighters 96 is also present here, but then we have some more refreshing characters too. These include Dimitri from the Darkstalker series, which makes a change from simply getting Morrigan in everything, Mega Man Zero from the rather underrated Game Boy Advance series, and the frickin' Mars people from Metal Slug 2. It is cliche at this point, but to quote Chief Palpatine, all of this was a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. Finally, the third type of boss is what is known as a secret boss. These are once again accessible by reaching certain requirements. If these requirements are met and you defeat the game's usual end boss, then extra cinematic sequences play before beginning a secret boss encounter. There is one Capcom character and one SNK character in this category. SNK brings to us Athena from the 1986 game Athena. Athena is significant and was popular in Japan at the time for being gaming's first ever bikini-clad heroine. So with her popularity in mind, she is a decent addition to this game's fighting roster. Finally, Capcom brings to the table a secret boss too, the gargoyle known as Redarima, who is featured in both the Ghost and Goblin series and the game's spin-off title known as Gargoyle's Quest. These are very fun and surprising additions to the game. All these characters are drawn using the King of Fighters art style and fight it out on a range of stages that suggest that the setting takes place in a post-apocalyptic Earth, with most stages appearing to be abandoned, decrepit, and mostly devoid of life. All in all, giving the game a unique aesthetic and feel that separates from all of the other Capcom and SNK crossover games. Whilst the game was released in the arcades in 2003, it was developed to run using an MVS arcade board, meaning that the game technically ran on tech that had debuted 13 years prior. So with this in mind, the game arguably does not look as good as Capcom's SNK crossover games, as they run on the much newer and more technically impressive Sega Naomi hardware, the counterpart to the Sega Dreamcast, rather than the Neo Geo AES. Obviously, being an MVS game also meant that SNK could also release the game on their aging AES hardware, meaning that people who own the AES could bring the exact arcade experience home. Thinking about it, it is bloody weird to think that the world was still getting games on a system as old as the AES after the Dreamcast had bitten the dust and most of us had moved on to PlayStation 2s and Xboxes. Reviews for the MVS and AES version of this game from the time period are scarce. However, I did manage to find one on GameTZ.com. It took a little over a decade, but finally the two worlds of SNK and Capcom collide on the Neo Geo home console, in the form of SNK vs Capcom Chaos. This highly anticipated game takes fighters from both sides and pins them against each other in an all-out battle. The graphics are a mixed bag, the fighters are all animated very well, and there are plenty of spectacular looking moves and effects. The music is pretty good, with various rock tunes playing in the back. I've heard better come out of my Neo Geo, but it's still pretty good. In the end, aside from a few problems, this is a fighting fan's dream come true. To be able to match Terry Bogard against Ryu or Iori against Ken Masters on a Neo Geo is like a little slice of heaven. If you got the cash to spend, $200-ish, I'd recommend picking this game up. SNK vs Capcom SVC Chaos would be the only fighting crossover game released by SNK or Playmore to be released on multiple platforms away from the company's own hardware. The game would also see releases on both the Sony PlayStation 2 and Microsoft Xbox. However, the PlayStation 2 version of the game missed a North American release. I have read a number of sources online that Sony Computer Entertainment's American game approval policy would prevent the game being released on the hardware due to its basic two-dimensional graphics, whereas others say it was not approved simply due to 2D fighting games no longer being popular in the region by that point. But take all of this with a pinch of salt, as I cannot find any solid evidence as to why the game was not released stateside on the PlayStation 2, yet made it everywhere else, including Europe. Out of these games, when playing the Xbox version of the game, you could have matches online using the Xbox Live feature, which we shall cover more on shortly. Anyway, let us take a look at how the mainstream console releases were perceived when eventually released, starting with GameSpot's perspective. They stated that SVC Chaos combined tons of different characters from each publisher's respective decade-old fighting game franchises, and let them and you have at it in traditional one-on-one martial arts matches. Not only does SVC Chaos simply not play particularly well by the standards of 2D fighting games, but also the game's implementation of Xbox Live support is flawed. The main problem with the live support is that you can't choose to have a rematch against the other player once a fight is over. That means as soon as you win or lose, you're first awkwardly prompted either to save a replay of the match or not, and then you're unceremoniously dropped at the Xbox Live main menu, where you can choose from the standard quick match and OptiMatch features all over again. Despite the problems with the live functionality and the actual gameplay, SVC Chaos can still be pretty fun if you find yourself pitted against a similarly skilled opponent. Nevertheless, the sort of long-time fighting game fans who'd be interested in this game will be quick to pick up on the flaws in the fighting mechanics. Simply put, the game feels rushed. The fundamentals of any good fighting game, namely the collision detection, which is to say the stuff that happens when one character hits another character, just aren't very well implemented in SVC Chaos. As mentioned, SVC Chaos's cast of characters is obviously the main attraction, although little care seems to have been given to ensure that the fighters were appropriately balanced. At any rate, the game basically plays okay, if just barely the controls are responsive for instance. You'll just wish that the whole thing felt more solid, instead of all flimsy and ramshackle. SVC Chaos looks like a Neo Geo fighting game, and the venerable Neo Geo hardware is about 15 years old now, so don't expect to be dazzled by the visuals here. In fact, if you're a fan of SNK fighting games, then don't expect to see a ton of new graphics. It's a shame that one of SNK's first forays onto the Xbox and its first attempts at taking its fighting games online is with a game that's decidedly below par, and yet still somehow promising. GameSpot would end up awarding the game a 6.3 out of 10, which, as you know, is pretty low for a review score, and the lowest score given to any fighting game I have ever covered on this channel yet. IGN too would only give 6 out of 10, stating, SVC Chaos, SNK vs Capcom is a decent fighter, with a stripped down fighting system that some may prefer over fancier, more combo studded variations. Stripped Down pretty much describes this game well in most respects. The graphics and sound aren't terrible, but then again they're also very old school, in both their design and in their technical approach. The online functions are probably the aspect that will really grab your interest and keep you playing well after you've beaten the game a zillion times. Whilst it's obvious this game was more or less slapped together and the online is as crude as it gets, at least the fighting in SNK vs Capcom holds up relatively well. Reviews across the information superhighway at the time all seem to draw similar conclusions, with the biggest criticisms for the Xbox version being the online features not being particularly well implemented and the graphics looking like they have come straight from the past. Obviously, these are all perspectives that have come directly from the dawn of the noughties. And looking at the amount of comments I regularly get asking me to cover the history of this game, it seems like perceptions have shifted somewhat over time. The game stands out for being the only game ever to see release that lets you play as the cast of Street Fighter II, drawn in the King of Fighters art style and placed into a world with a King of Fighters play style. In those respects, the game is very unique, and it is also pretty novel that you can play using Street Fighter characters on the Neo Geo AES home system, a platform that some would argue to be the greatest home console for fighting games in the history of mankind. Then we have the winds of change through the sands of time itself to factor into this. No longer do we live in a world where 3D gaming is the only graphical style that is respected by gamers and journalists alike, and although SVC Chaos was criticised for its looks, the game now looks a lot more beautiful than many games reviewers were gushing about at the time. Like, let's be honest, which game looks graphically better today? GTA 3, one of the best looking games around during its prime, or SVC Chaos? I can guarantee that most people would choose the latter. The 2D graphics are more of a positive today, rather than a hindrance like when the game was first released on the Xbox in 2004. The Xbox PS2 era is legitimately my least favourite era in gaming due to this fault track. So whilst SVC Chaos clearly has its flaws, the game is certainly a lot less flawed looking at the game through a modern lens than it was on release. Is the game as significant or well produced as Capcom's crossover games? Well, obviously not. However, it is still an important game with its own flavour that marks the final chapter in the Capcom vs SNK crossover game fighting series. So really, it is a welcome addition to anyone's gaming library. Yeah. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the mad story of SNK vs Capcom SVC Chaos. Let me know in the comment section what you think of this game and share some of your experiences with it. Leave a comment down below and subscribe for multiple videos a week covering various facets of gaming history. There's new fighting game content every single Thursday. Finally, my channel is partially funded by the generous donations I receive via Patreon. Patrons can earn a credit and a shout out at the end of these videos. These people make working full time on YouTube just that little bit less scary. So I would like to thank you all very much for that. So huge shout outs go out to Carl Johnson, Sebastian Velez, JD Robbins, Tint Spacies, Andrew Bazanski, Asobi Kwang DX, Michael Baker, Tom Elliott, Computer Man, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Daniel Daly, RetroReversing.com, House of the Ted, Dan Barlow Jr., Joel, and all of my other patrons. Yeah. Cheerio.